This podcast is sponsored by Tusk, an open source non-ICO crypto project powered by community. Check them out on the web at tusk.network. That's TUSC.network. The Rob McNealy program is the nexus of cryptocurrency, blockchain technology, and entrepreneurship. Now, welcome to the program. Hey folks, Rob McNealy here, and we have another great show for you today. I am joined by someone who I've been connected with on social media for a long time and a big follower of, and his name is Jack Connor. He is the co-founder of this interesting company that's focused on the medical space called Hospital Flip. He is also a renowned author, a renowned skateboarder, and I think he does everything that most supermen should be able to do. So he's doing a lot of really fun stuff. And, Jack, welcome to the show. How are you today?
Thank you for having me on, Rob. Great to be on, and great to meet you in person. You know, we've talked a lot over Twitter and social media, had a lot of great conversations. So it's really fun to be here in person.
Well, it's good. And one of the things I like about you, and I'm going to sound like I got some bromance thing going on, but you're a tech guy, but you also get business. And I think that's pretty important because a lot of times those two aren't in the same person. The business guy and the dev guy, those are usually different guys. And so when you find those kind of qualities in one person, that usually they're kind of interesting individuals. So
I started out as the business guy before this is also kind of a rare thing where, I had gotten a master's in business and I had lived abroad a bunch. So I'd started businesses, started one in China briefly, and had done startups here in the States and stuff like that. And I was really into digital startups, and I came from a family that had a lot of programmers. I had been exposed to it. So 6 or 7 years ago, I did did the boot camp thing and went full career switch by just basically putting my head down and programming about 14 hours a day for a year. And then ended up completely switching careers and, getting into that side. But part of it is that I knew I wanted to do startups and wanted to have control over the product itself. I wanted to be able to build things. And so it was a little bit risky, as like career switching always is, but I also found like I really loved it. And I kind of knew that about it ahead of time, that, programming for me is one of the first jobs I've had that I really love it on a minute by minute basis, where it's like, really fun solving problems. But when you talk about that business programming orientation, I was not a computer science major, studied linguistics, really nerded out on languages. Again, there's a little bit of relation there in terms of kind of like the skill level, but yeah, and agreed. It's been really fun talking startups and business with you. You bring a really interesting perspective from the Utah startup scene. And, I'm in Long Beach right outside LA, and neither one of those is Silicon Valley. So we have kind of, that to compare against. But yeah, we've had some good conversations on the topic.
Yeah, I think that, and we mentioned this off the air, but I think there's a big thing about startups that you see that there's lots of startups out there that have nothing to do with technology, and they generally form differently than a lot of technology startups. So, I'm originally from the Midwest, and someone like me, I would just think, oh, if I want to start a business, you go borrow a little bit of money from your dad or your uncle, get a small business loan, and then you just kind of bootstrap it and start up a business. And that it's very normal among low tech businesses, let's say contractors and construction and retailers and things like that. It's just a very different mindset of just like, let's just get to work. Whereas, it's interesting, especially with Tusk and getting into the crypto space, I'm closer to like Silicon Valley kind of software and that whole culture than I ever have been in my life. And so even though I've been an entrepreneur for a number of years now, seeing the culture of like, I've never done anything in my life before, I have an idea in a pitch deck and I'm going to raise millions of dollars, is baffling to me.
I don't know if that actually still exists unless you've already maybe exited a startup. Because when I talk, but maybe this is where I'm at. I've had startups, never exited, never, never had some mega success, anything like that. And it's, whether it's accelerators or VCs or basically anything outside of maybe just a pitch night, they do really it's hard to get a seat at the table if you don't have something that's in the marketplace, or at least, and this is for digital stuff. This is not for, medical startups, which, like a patent can raise, tens of millions of dollars, or although you're in the crypto space. So I take back everything I said, because crypto might actually have that, where you're raising money off speculate, we're going to build this blockchain for X, Y, and Z. I do not know, confession, I do not know that much about crypto, outside of the implementation side and some of the, record sides of it. But, yeah, I don't know. It's interesting. So what's your experience been like building Tusk?
Building Tusk's been interesting. Well, the thing is, I've never managed like an open source project before, and so that's kind of been
right.
interesting.
You guys are open source, so that's an interesting viewpoint into to working with developers as well.
Oh, open source, decentralized kind of project. Well, it's interesting from a startup perspective, since we have a coin and have had a token traded in markets for 2.5 years. From the minute you start like a crypto project like this, you're an internationally traded, an international publicly held company, essentially. And so even though I've had a lot of startup experience, I've been an entrepreneur, a self-sufficient entrepreneur for a long time, meaning that I've made a living actually as an entrepreneur for a long time. And that's baffling to me, because even some of those things, I've worked, when I was back in a corporate MBA guy, I worked for some big companies, some big international companies. And so I know what that looks like, but I've never been in charge as an entrepreneur. I've never had like in charge of a mega corporation that's been internationally traded and things like that. So that's one of the different things about it. And then being decentralized. So when we started as a token project, we had control, even though we set it up as what they call a low profit LLC. But when we decided to build our own blockchain and move from our token to become Tusk, we became a public blockchain. So what happened is, the minute we essentially, before we traded, the minute we let the outside block producers come in and take over the network from our test net, I have no control over the project. I'm a co-founder. I have influence just because I am the guy who's been with it since the beginning. But it's interesting just from a standpoint that I no longer have control. And so you just got to like beg, you got to beg people to help out, essentially, and trying to do deals and trying to sort out partnerships, with these weird nuances. It's interesting. It's just a very interesting space. And then there's so much fraud and bullshit. It's just a tough space, to be honest.
Well, I tend to want to have a lot of control on the digital projects that I build, and especially in recent years, I've architected and done, majority of the code for a lot of the things I've worked on. And so, yeah, that might be tough. It's, delegations for big digital projects, delegation's huge, because you can't do everything yourself, and you have to have people you work with that you can trust to, build a feature correctly and not put massive security flaws in it and things like that. Open source would be interesting. I admit, like, I haven't worked on that many open source projects. I feel like when I want to build something, I just kind of like come up with it and just start, tinkering on an MVP myself. But it's a wild world. Yeah, I'd like to check out your project a little more. Maybe get involved or something.
We could put you to work, because we need everything. Though a lot of good things are happening, and so we had to structure how we kind of try to deal with some of the things, like with a lot of and I'm not here to pitch Tusk, but one of the I always shill if I get it.
Give it a plug, yeah.
So is there's just a lot of challenges, right? Getting shit done is not easy when, everybody's trying to like hope that the tokens that you paid them with, will be worth something at some point. And a lot of people have a hard time, and they're not patient all the time with that stuff. And so, it's interesting. I always try to tell people that are.
Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I was just going to interject that working and production level in digital, there, in my experience, there's about a 10x difference in the amount of time and the amount of code that you need to put in to get something that works well versus something that's truly production level, doesn't have even those tail bugs that only happen on, Internet Explorer in certain situations, or someone who hasn't updated their Chrome or, something like that.
I could
No,
tell you a Chrome problem right now.
I bet. Yeah. And, you're kind of you're a gun guy. And I think that there's a level of perfectionism you have to have for both of them that actually, sometimes there might be a little bit of an overlap if you want to be really good at it.
I think so. I think attention to detail, things need to work, and things need to, you have to have the right tool for the right job. So yeah, I see there's a lot of it. But I've adapted. And the thing is, the last 2.5 years, like, we were talking earlier about, serial entrepreneurs being ADD, and then they, jump from one thing before they finish the other. And I can tell you, I've learned a lot of patience over the last 2.5 years working in this environment. I mean, when you're not technically employing somebody, but, how do you get stuff done? And it's actually made me more patient, I guess, and so, but I'm still, I always think like an entrepreneur. I'm not going to change that, right? That's just going to be how I view the world through those lenses. I'm not a developer, so I don't think of the world through a developer's eyes either, right? But I think that's the interesting thing with like open source and crypto. This is what I tell people, like, how do you explain like open source and decentralized projects to like, a gun shop owner, right? A lot of them tend to be pretty low tech depending on where you are.
I feel like you don't. I mean, that's something that we have in ours with, where I can explain our business as asynchronous telemedicine for physical therapy, and, people's eyes glaze over. But then I'm just like, no, you just do your exam at home and it sends it to the doctor, try and keep it as simple. And I'm a big fan of not using big words when you don't have to. Because for me, it's like language. Like I said, like I nerd out in language, and I think at the end of the day, language is all about communication. And so when you're explaining something, it's like, you got to know who you're explaining it to. Like if I talk to you versus a developer versus a salesperson about my business, it's all going to be a little bit different. But I think the true communicator is someone who knows how to like break it down for whoever the hell you're talking to,
I described Tusk like this. I said, when someone asks, what's a decentralized project? Because outside of crypto, that's never really happened, right? That's a new thing, kind of, at least in modern times. And I say, well, think about it somewhere between a co-op and a nonprofit. Oh, okay. That makes sense. And that's how I explain it. I'm like, that's what it is. It's somewhere between a co-op and a nonprofit, because that's what it really is if you think about it, right? And there is no company making money. We're not profit driven from that, way. We don't even, and so that's kind of true, and so I think you're right. Don't use big words when you don't need to. I mean,
unless you want to impress ladies, or I don't know if that works. I don't think that works. Actually, they're probably smarter than that.
Maybe some ladies, I don't know. It didn't work with my wife. She's smarter than me. So she knew more words than I did. So it was all good. But I would say this, it's like, it's like how writers write, like, and even within science and business, sometimes people write in a way. You got an MBA, I got an MBA, right? So it's like, business writing is interesting too. But I think, I read this statistic a while back, and it made a lot of sense to me from a business standpoint. You look at some of the most famous classics that are out there, like Ernest Hemingway, at least in modern times, right? The Ernest Hemingways of the world. And they said, and there was an algorithm and some AI thing to analyze the reading level of some of these works. And they found that the most successful works, including things like Harry Potter, are written at a very low level. So essentially, like, and I don't know if this was, done deliberately back then, or maybe it was just innate that they said, oh, I want it for the common person. But what happened is, apparently Old Man and the Sea by Ernest Hemingway was written at a 4th grade level.
Well, let me ask you a question. Do you ever read Stephen King? I'm not going to say
a long time ago.
I'm not going to say he's my. Sorry to interrupt you there. I was going to say he's not necessarily my favorite author, but I've read a million books by Stephen King, and I love horror. I love horror books. The novel is the best form of horror, in my opinion. It's the scariest if you get a really good one. And he also has got to write at a third grade level, a fourth grade level, but in the best way possible, where it's like common vernaculars. He's one of the reasons he's so effective. Like you're never more immersed in a fiction book than if you're reading something by Stephen King, like The Shining or Pet Sematary. He describes everything in the room, like everything, like you know exactly what's happening, where you are. It's one of the most immersive experiences you could possibly have reading a book. And just like you're saying about Ernest Hemingway, it's very simple language. And I think that's part of the magic of it. You're not trying to decipher it. You know what I mean?
I would say there actually is a little more scientific than that. And I think it's scientific from the standpoint is that as you expand your population size, the average reading ability in the United States and everywhere pretty much goes down. And so if you wrote a book at, say, a 12th grade level, and the bell curve of your population's reading comprehension is at the 4th grade level, you just lost what, 3/4 of your potential market size. And so if you bring down that reading level, it doesn't mean that you dumb it down, but you bring the the required reading comprehension level down, you expand your market dramatically.
Absolutely.
And so the more people that may be in your market, you're probably more likely to win financial success from what you're doing.
This is 100% accurate. This is very true. Although I'd say the same effect might be part of the reason that I feel it's so hard to find a good adult movie these days, because they've kind of, when it comes to sort of, especially Hollywood blockbuster movies, they've taken what you just said, especially when you're taking international markets into account, to the extreme, and you sort of end up with like your Transformers movies that are play in China, play in Indonesia, play in Brazil, but are kind of the same, just like nonsense bullshit in every language.
Well, here's an interesting thing, it's like, depending on where you are, I mean, look at the average IQ, that can get into a very political discussion about, different, developed people in some developing countries have lower IQs on average. And so, or they have much lower literacy rates or, numeracy rates and stuff in those places. So if you're focusing on a global audience where it may be playing in developing nations, you bring that down, you did just expand your market. Now, the problem is you might have almost, gone too far on the domestic side. So, and I think that's where, a lot of things just seem ridiculous. Like I have a really hard time. I don't normally watch sitcoms, but if I watch any kind of like national, I don't have cable. So I don't really, so when I'm traveling or something, I like flick on the TV and say, oh, I haven't watched this in 6 months. And now I know why I haven't watched this in 6 months. But if you look at I think they've almost dumbed it down too much in the United States at this point. And I think that gets annoying to people. Like,
sounds like you were watching 2.5 Men.
You know what? I've never watched an episode of that. And
that's one of those TV shows, not to just harp on the dumbing down of TV, because that's sort of like, I mean, that's a bottomless well of stupidity. But 2.5 Men is one of those shows that was like the most popular. It was the highest rated show for about 10 years. And I didn't know a single person that could watch more than 5 minutes of it without just like turning it off in boredom and disgust. Like, it's so bad. And it's just one of those mysteries of, you're talking about cultures and populations and things translating and kind of like making something for the lowest common denominator. And it's still really, and we talk about the difference between California and Utah and all kinds of things like that. But like, it's pretty wild what that like kind of works for everybody is. It really is sometimes at that Honey Boo Boo level of just like the really lowest common, the Steven Seagal police reality show, things like that,
Well, it's interesting. I mean, you even look at what are the most popular sports, right? I think the 2 most popular sports, I think NASCAR is number 1, right? I think NASCAR is the number 1 spectator sport, right? That's, at least it was like not that long ago. And then it's like NFL. And then, so if you look at what are the things that are, and again, it goes back to markets, but the things that are the largest economic, successes, right, as far in a given industry. And yeah, it's sometimes I'm like, these people vote. It's like, the average American is average. And that means, half the people. So if the average IQ in the United States is around 100,
Mm-hmm.
and that's the average, that means half the people you meet are below. True story.
It's true.
So, and that's pretty scary, thinking about that.
Have you ever done jury
Um,
duty?
I almost got in. I didn't get picked though.
I did
Went
jury
to the
duty in
pool.
Chicago once. That was a wild experience.
Cook County
Definitely.
or
Yeah, in
DeKalb?
Cook County. And it was definitely like a diverse, in every way, like income levels, race, blah, blah, blah. I mean, it was at, I forget where it was, in the city of Chicago, but you definitely saw like, and I think a lot of people get this experience where you kind of think that your point of view is like more or less what most other people are thinking. And then you really get thrust into the situation with, a lot of different people where there's some stakes to it. And you sort of see like, oh, that's not actually the case. You know what I mean? And I think jury duty is can be a pretty eye-opening situation for a lot of people.
Well, for my day job, I do forensic consulting in my field, and it actually, I don't talk about it that often on the podcast
Uh-huh.
because it's not, I'm more focused on Tusk and crypto and small business. But in my day job, I'm actually pretty successful as a consultant, and I work all over the country, and it's very flexible in time. So it gives me the opportunity to basically commit myself full time to Tusk and only have to work part time on that business. And I used to think, that the world was a lot more black and white, 5, 6,
Yeah.
7 years ago. And when I started getting into consulting and testimony and doing depositions, and I went through interrogation training and investigation training because I do accident
Uh-huh.
claims. Like
Wow.
I do occasionally death cases, like
Uh-huh.
people that get in an accident, and get hurt. And so I have, as part of my job, I have to interview people, even on an insurance type of claim or something like that. I have to interview people on a regular basis. Like I did one today? No, two yesterday, so it's just like when you then get around and you start seeing how people will lie to cover themselves up. People won't
Mm-hmm.
take responsibility. People are not forthright. And I've seen it in court numerous times where I saw someone I might respect, or someone, a friend of mine, and they testified on the other side of a case. And I'm like, they straight up lied. And I'm just like, wow, you and I both know this is not what you just said in court.
Mm-hmm.
And then dealing with people like where they, I interview somebody and then I might do an investigation or inspection, gather data and gather evidence and stuff. And I find that the evidence routinely will prove that the person lied, and you're just like, it's
Mm-hmm.
amazing how often people are deceptive. And I think, and I also, that a lot of times there's negligence to go around. And that was the interesting thing about, working in legal environments as part of my job. Like that's only a part of what I do. So I spend a lot of our time doing just consulting for people, but when I do the legal stuff, it's like you will see, how often everybody's like, it's their fault. It's their fault. But then when you really look at it, it's all their fault.
Mm-hmm. Oh my
And
God. Yeah.
as I've gotten older, I see that more and more situations in society are gray. They're not clear
Mm-hmm.
cut. They're black and white. There's fault that goes around everywhere. And that's where I usually see the most conflict is where everybody's got a problem and they don't want it to be theirs. And in
Mm-hmm.
fact, it actually makes my job harder sometimes when you
There
got
was
like,
easy solutions. People would implement them. I think that's something that actually does occur a lot, and it's a lot of anger. And this is, of course, like pretty topical in a couple of ways, but when there aren't easy solutions and there's a lot of frustration or like a problem is just building and building and building. Yeah, man. Like, I mean, that's one of the ways, like, where rage comes out, where like anger turns into rage, is when like there isn't an outlet, you know what I mean? Or there isn't that solution that you can, if I have, if my faucet gets broken, I can figure out how to fix it. But if it's like something that I just like literally, there's, what is the fix? So it's a lot more nebulous and it's a lot scarier.
well, I think this is what scares me, is that when the masses have been convinced that the cause of their problems is not what the actual cause is. And then people get worked up, and once someone's been convinced of something, you generally can't change their minds.
Mm-hmm.
And so and this is a problem. And this is a problem because if you don't know the root cause of your problem, you can't solve the problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is very true. And we were talking about this earlier regarding politics, but I come from a very split household with one parent who's very conservative, one parent who's very liberal, and so I get the quote unquote pleasure of getting both sides to every issue. A lot of times, like, yelled at me on the phone, like, I can't believe, whatever. But it's one of those things where, like, and a lot of times you just don't have the energy for it. But there's, and this is, I didn't want to get political, but one example that has come up a lot is, and I'm not taking any sides on this, but is climate change, where one thing I had noticed is that both sides, and DM me if you want to talk about this and get more details, but not getting into it, but both sides tend to argue very different points of climate change. In a lot of situations, they're not even talking about the same thing. And, where it's like, and this is as a person who's kind of like, I mean, I for better or for worse, if, you get like both sides of an issue and you hear both sides of people and you see both sides of biases and things like that, you kind of, and I know that this has happened to you a lot, is, you can see where there's, one, where both, either left or right or whomever, when they're picking out straw men, it tends to be pretty obvious. And this, of course, happens a lot. And, you and I are on Twitter a lot, which is kind of like deadly. The kingdom of the straw men argument. But yeah, it's tough, man. And it's, sorry to bring up climate change. I know that's is that gonna get this episode like censored, kicked off Google or something?
No, I think it has to be the opposite side of it.
Okay.
I just say those damn penguins got to figure their shit out. That's all I know. Those polar bears.
Yeah. I love the polar bears.
Yeah,
it's a complicated, and that's another thing where, again, not to get into it, but like one of many issues where, like, there's a ton of things, there's a ton of big problems that don't have solutions that we know about, and this is very difficult to deal with.
I think there's lots of problems that we have big problems that we could solve that are more important than some of these other things. And it's really tough. I mean, especially everybody's like, get into like the whole riots and stuff lately, the looting and all that. I mean, it's really hard when there's not a good side. Like, you can see, like, I can see the points on everybody's side, and I can see lots of mistakes made on both sides. And so that doesn't, in my mind, it makes it really hard to pick a side. And the one thing I don't like about our society, especially the U.S. society, Americans, is that we want it to be left or right, black and white.
Binary. We want it to be a side. We want it to be like a sport almost.
Yeah, if you're not with me, you're against us. You're not with me. I even had a friend of mine that we got along with really, really well. And, he was basically taking this position, he got really upset and about the whole Black Lives Matter thing. And he was just like, well, and I wasn't arguing with him. Just saying, I think this is not the problem you think it is. And over some different elements. And he got really mad at me, and he's like, well, if you're not gonna, support Black Lives Matter, you don't support me, and blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, dude, we're friends. I have no beef with you. And I'm like, have I ever been giving you we've worked together on things professionally. Have I ever given you a hard time about anything?
This is tough, man. It's very volatile right now. And I know that this is not news to you in any sense, but like this story you're telling me, I've heard over and over. And it goes both ways. And there's a lot of, one of the shitty things is like, there's Black Lives Matter, and, there's like defunding the police and Blue Lives Matter and like anti-maskers. There's a half dozen things out there that are causing family breakups to happen right now. Like, tensions are high. And
No,
I think that part of this is, I mean, one of the, if you have a lot of different hotspots culturally, I mean, part of me, not to like get too psychological, but I think this just in general, because of the pandemic, a lot of pent up frustration and a lot of pent up energy. You know what I mean?
I,
And
I absolutely agree with that. And I think it'll be interesting to see how things go in the next 6 months if this cools down, but I don't think it's going to. No one's going to accept the election. No one's going to accept a cure or
God,
vaccine for COVID. It's like we're at all these impasses, and now we got this weird culture war, on your opinion, like riots aren't riots anymore. And if you don't want your property burned down, you're like on the other side. And I'm like, this is just not good for a society.
it's
Like,
rough. And this is, and doing as a skateboarder, I gotta say, like, I was thrown in a cop car before I was 12 years old. Like, I've had cops, like I've seen cops break boards, I've seen cops yell at kids, all kinds of things like that. If you're a skateboarder, you're basically like half the time wherever you're skating, it's illegal, and skaters tend to have a lot of run-ins with cops. So when all these videos start coming out of like cops like beating the shit out of old people and stuff, there wasn't a skateboarder on the planet that was surprised about it. Like, this is, and it's one of those things where, in my experience, like 7 or 8 police officers out of 10 that I've had personal experience with, like in Chicago and LA, are totally cool. Greatest people in the world, like they'll come, like you're skateboarding, they get a call because you're in some school or something, and they come and they're just like, you can't do that here. You get out, no big deal. But like every once in a while, and not as every once in a while as you want it to be, like there's somebody who is power tripping like crazy. And, I've known people who worked at the, for the police, military, all kinds of stuff like that. And like, they'll basically tell you the same thing. Like they all know that 1 or 2 people at the precinct, or at least I've heard people kind of mention that. And this is one of the things. And so like, whichever way, and there's obviously a lot of, backlash, but we're in this really insane political time where, is it Trump in the lead polling? Is it Biden? Like blah, blah, blah. Like everything is switching. We're, if somebody listens to this a month out, like everything will have changed completely regarding 10 catastrophic events will have happened, and who knows where the polls will be. But, yeah, it's, I say it's like on the anti-cop thing, like, I don't know if defunding the cops is the solution, because I'm from Chicago, and Chicago's a major crime problem. And this seems to be exasperating the crime problem in at least certain areas. But I don't know,
like New York, Minneapolis, Seattle, and Portland.
Yeah. But this is also, but then you're getting the thing is like, oh, well, but if they just defunded the cops, that it hasn't even kicked in yet. Like, who the fuck knows? You know what I mean? But like, I'm trying to not take sides here.
Well, I think you don't have to take a side.
No,
I think that at some point that you don't have to have a side to say that when a group of people are angry about something, that they're not immediately going to go riot and burn things down. I don't think that's a racial position, or it shouldn't even be a controversial position. But right now, this is recorded for posterity. It is a weird position that.
Well, I think it's a little bit less. Should they do it? Well, I don't know. I mean, it's like, what's the psychological position for that? Because like, when you say like, should someone burn something down for this? It's, yeah. I don't know. Anyway, I don't want to. I don't want to get into that. Continue what you were saying. I was going down a road that I don't know if it had a.
Yeah, don't go down that. I mean, look, I understand. There's one thing if you literally live under a dictator that literally is doing all the things that dictators have been accused of. Then if you want to fight that system because that system is unjust, I mean, I have a theory about cops, because I grew up white, but I grew up fairly lower middle class, fairly poor, did not grow up in a nice neighborhood. And
Detroit cops got a reputation too, man. We heard about you guys in Chicago.
I lived in like one burb over, but the reality is, I know growing up white and poor, we got hassled a lot. I remember this clearly. I got not pulled over 9 times in 8 months when I was 16. because I had like a mullet and I drove like a beat up old Firebird. And so, and I grew up in a bad neighborhood. So it's like, yeah, we just screw with you. And I've had cops be very disrespectful to me. I would say about a dozen times in my life,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm not a troublemaker. It's just when I was a kid, you got pulled over for being a kid with a mullet driving a piece of crap car. And that was just how it was. And I think that for some power tripping cops out there, if they're going to pay, like, they're bullies, just like anybody else, any
Mm-hmm.
industry, they have bullies, right? Well, bullies tend to pick on people they think they can get away with it from, right? I mean, it's not going to be the white shoed guy from, Manhattan that you're going to shake down and beat the crap up on the side of the road, on the side of the road because you're having a bad day.
Mm-hmm.
He knows his rights. Two, he's probably got the money. He's probably smarter than you, and he's probably got the money to hire really good lawyers.
And
And maybe
you actually make an interesting point too, where it's also an unusual target. Like somebody hassling 16-year-old you with the mullet, which, by the way, I'm ready to see those pictures of you with the mullet anytime you want. So
they're not digital. I'd have to scan them. I'm not doing it.
I can wait. Don't worry about it. But whether it's you, whether whoever, there's a million different, like, quote unquote targets for cops, skateboarder, somebody of the wrong ethnicity, whatever it is. Yeah, it's really easy to become a target for that type of police officer. And part of it is because, like, if a cop pulled over you when you were 16 with the mullet driving your 77 Thunderbird or whatever it was,
75 Firebird with the big black Pontiac 400. Thank you.
But who would believe you over them? You're not just an easy target, you're a very safe target.
Mm-hmm. And so, I have to wonder based on that. And I spent a lot of time in the inner city as well. I had a business in an inner city. And so, I saw how people interacted with cops, and I saw how cops treated people they were interacting with. And, did I think that, I don't know, I would say that, in my opinion, most people's problems in this world are self-induced. You and I have talked about this on Twitter, for instance. COVID didn't make people broke. They were already broke, and they were fragile.
Mm-hmm.
And the same thing with businesses. Businesses should have an emergency fund just like individuals. And if they're not putting money away for an emergency, they're fragile.
Mm-hmm.
COVID just exposed that.
Well, this is, the restaurant, not to pick on restaurants who are having a really difficult time right now, but this is a really interesting question, which is, if your typical restaurant had, and I think it was something like 12 to 14 days of working capital in the bank. And that was, that's like your typical restaurant in the United States. You invoked fragile. That is a very fragile position. It took the pandemic obviously caused a lot of closures for more than 2 weeks, more than a month. But it's not the only thing in history that could have done it. Like weather events, who knows, an E. coli outbreak. There's one of a million long, fat tail events that could happen in that. But it does kind of make you think that maybe we are, maybe we're building this system that's just like based way too much on money coming in to just keep things running.
Just in time.
Yeah.
Everything's just in time.
And it's funny because I used to be a big advocate of just in time, because I thought, because it's like very clever, and clever is actually what you find out is kind of like one of the curses of modern life in a lot of situations. But you look at something, like Zara or H&M, and they have this insanely complex, or not, maybe not complex, but this very well done supply chain. And it's really amazing. And you're like, oh, it's almost a work of art, it's so efficient. And then one thing like one monkey wrench gets thrown into the gears. And then we're in this situation where now, pandemic, COVID was obviously more than a monkey wrench, but, and then the whole thing shuts down. Like, that's the problem of having a finely tuned motor that doesn't work if anything goes wrong, is that it's kind of all or nothing,
And yeah, and the problem is when people are ill prepared for change or for that system to fail,
Mm-hmm.
that's when things get really ugly.
Yeah.
And so, and you're right, I think, think of all the things that can make things, I mean, let's talk about realistic things. How about an invasion can shut things down for a while,
Mm-hmm.
ruin supply
Like
chains,
Red Dawn style.
like Red Dawn style, absolutely. And I think, what if you had like two hurricanes and a major earthquake happen within a month period? You're
Mm-hmm.
going to have major sections of the country shut down
Mm-hmm.
for that. I mean, there's so many different
What's the
possibilities.
solar flare that they keep talking about?
The EMP, the
ERP. Is it an
EMP,
EMP event?
electromagnetic pulse,
Yeah. Yeah. Well, this
natural
is.
or man-made.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, there's like literally like, if you go back 500 years and look at all the events of like this that could have shut down society for more than a couple of days, big volcano going off, or an asteroid hitting or something. And I know that they're all like long tailed, but eventually one of these is going to happen. And we do see, now you're getting me into something that I do feel passionately about, but we need a motherfucking plan. You know what I mean? Like, otherwise, we've been around for 12,000 years. 12,000, or I think that one site in Turkey is from, I think, 17,000 BC. I think that's the oldest, evidence of civilization we have. Like, this is definitely not very long on like an Earth scale, and it's very not long on a cosmic space scale. And so I was watching, I don't watch a lot of TV, but I really love the show Doctor Who. And I was watching an episode that takes place 250,000 years in the future. And, there's like mankind is living on a different, star system and stuff like that. And I just remember thinking, like, if we're going to get to 250,000 years, like, we need some robustness. And this pandemic kind of proved, like, we didn't have a plan for this. Like, we kind of thought we had a plan. I think if you had asked every single person in the world in a year ago today, like, could humanity handle an epidemic pretty well, most people would have thought, yeah, man, we got it. Like, I saw that movie where the WHO swoops in and they isolate, an outbreak, they isolate the region, and everybody instantly has all their perfect PPE, and there's one person got stabbed by a dirty needle, but we got that under control. And the reality is it was just a complete and utter shit show from day one, and it never really got any better.
Nope. And I think I said this before that, if we can't come together as a country to create policies and plans to deal with COVID, which
Mm-hmm.
as deadly as it could be a lot worse, is that what happens when the next deadly bug comes around, or slightly deadlier bug comes around, or an actual bioweapon gets unleashed in the United States? What are we going to do? Well, we're going to argue about wearing masks and comply, and then politicians are just going to do dumb stuff because they want to get reelected. And I think we're host. I think that exposed a cultural, and that's the thing, watching all this COVID stuff is watching how people are reacting to it, and
Mm-hmm.
what are they doing because of it. And I am worried now that maybe Bill Gates is right, because we're so screwed culturally in the United States. If we had a serious shit show kind of thing come through, not saying that 185,000 people dead so far isn't a shit show, but it could be a lot worse. It could be millions. I think we're really weak. And
Mm-hmm.
that scares me as a culture. I fear that we can't survive something really tough.
In this sense, I agree. I mean, I think there's a lot of ways we're strong, but in this, like, we really dropped the ball. Also, I need to get that audio drop of you saying Bill Gates was right. I feel like that's something. I feel like that's not something you say every day, so I was pretty happy about that.
No, and yeah, and depending, half the listeners will say that I'm trying to, kill them with chemtrails or something. Um, but ultimately, I think that, you look at the countries that are dealing with COVID the best, and how they did that is they came together and basically backed their governments with a unified plan.
Mm-hmm.
And the ones that did the best had the highest compliance with those plans. And I think the problem is in the United States, it became a political, I'm not here to judge, Donald Trump, but there was a lot of denial in the beginning. And then in New York, there was a lot of denial with the Democrat politicians there and Democrat governor. And so they all dropped the ball, in my opinion. And I think the fact that that everyone wanted to make it a political issue, and then everybody dug in, and then the tribal lines were set.
And then nothing happened. I mean, we just fought about it, and the action. I mean, it's it's not like nothing happened. Like there was, testing centers were open, drive-throughs were open. Things did go down, but especially at a national level, like I couldn't even tell you what our federal government did regarding COVID that was especially useful. You know what I mean? Like everything I've seen at least for me is all more or less at a local level. Like the things opened here was more or less like Long Beach grants. I mean, I'm sure I'm missing something because I've not followed the whole trail of money and anything like that. But
well, I used to be emergency responder, and I can tell you that most and especially on the biological stuff, most of that is responded and supposed to be responded to by the local governments. That is how it's supposed to work.
Yeah.
Public health is done at a county level, pretty much in every county in the country. And then even additionally, sometime at the municipal level, like so Denver and a lot of cities still have government hospitals, and so that's where disaster response normally comes from. But with the biological and public health is almost always done at the local and state level. And so I don't necessarily fault the government for that. What I fault the government for is how generally the leadership did not come together behind a unified plan. Everybody dug in and made it a political issue. And I think that shows me that people on both sides of the aisle care more about their tribe than they do of solving problems. And that's unfortunate.
Well, I got a question for you though, as especially coming from your background. Do you think that this whole event, that one potential upside could be a big uptick in people kind of like taking control of their own lives, like being like, I mean, something that I had the sort of questionable blessing of, growing up in Chicago, there's like, it's very corrupt in Chicago. And I was there under like the, second mayor Daley, and there'd be like photos of him like having dinner with mob bosses and stuff. Like it wasn't even, and going ice fishing with gangsters and, things like that. Like people laughed about it. And so I never really, for better or for worse, I just never really trusted the government. I was always kind of taught like it was just all corrupt and it was all kind of blah, blah, blah. And I'm not saying people shouldn't trust the government, because Chicago is kind of its own special little situation. But I do think the pandemic, I mean, even with everything from this gardening and bread making to, you were talking about like liberals buying guns and people moving to the country. Do you think there's going to be an uptick in like decentralization, localization, and basically people just saying, hey, I'm kind of on my own, so let's figure this thing out, take care of ourselves?
I think COVID showed us very quickly that the technological infrastructure was there. So I would say a family member of mine, their office went all remote. And that was really hard for the company to go all remote. And then after like 6-8 weeks of the company going remote, because part of the company was really trying to get people back in the office as much as possible. But then they found that most of the people don't want to go back. And they just decided to like stop leasing, some Class A office space. So I think COVID started that. And I think the fact is, I think more people are going to homeschool. People are seeing that. So I think we're not done here to, we haven't finished all these things out lately, but I think the bigger trigger for the gun sales, and I know this, and then it's the riots and the burnings. And I think that's going to scare the hell out of people, and people are going to rethink being in an urban area because of that. And I think that's a different animal, and we don't know how that's going to play out. So and I think this is interesting about the current protests, riots, whatever you want to call them, right? And, they never used to allow riots and protests to go on as long as these have been allowed.
Mm-hmm.
in various cities. Like like Portland and Seattle's like 3 months solid, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think the government, if you go back and look at like 92 in LA, and you go back and look at, the riots in the 70s and late 60s in Detroit, those things only lasted a couple days. And then they're over with and people cleaned up and moved on.
Mm-hmm.
I think the problem we're seeing, and this is why I said I don't know where I think this is going to go. I think there's a lot of things seems to be getting worse, not better. But I would say from the prepping standpoint,
Mm-hmm.
the longer these violent riots, because they're violent riots, these are not protests. They're violent. When people are getting killed and people are burning, whole areas to the ground, that's no longer protest. And so I think the longer it's allowed to go on, I mean, think about it. The cops haven't been shooting anybody with real bullets, right? And they certainly did in 92, and they certainly did in the 60s and the 70s. And so, I know in the Detroit riots in 68, one of my friend's dads was in the National Guard at the time,
Mm-hmm.
and he quote unquote said, we stacked them up like cordwood. And
Holy
you wouldn't,
shit.
oh yeah.
Yeah.
And it's like, and so if you look at how many people were declared dead during the Detroit riots, apparently that number was like 10x or something. Like, a lot of people got shot.
Well, ain't no photos
Um,
going on social media back then. You know what I mean?
there are some photos though. There are some pretty damning photos, but it was like,
But not with the immediacy. Not like they wouldn't get out like that unless a
next day
Detroit
newspaper.
press. Yeah. So unless somebody happened to get it.
Yeah. And so I think that the fact is governments, I mean, there's no water cannons, right? There's no LRADs running around.
What
So
was the last one? There's no what?
LRADs, those audible things that are this, noisy things that.
Oh, it's like the noise.
Yeah.
To basically get people to disperse by playing.
But
like
it's the one that has like an acoustic thing to it that actually has some pressure. I don't know, something like that. But they have all these other
sonic
tools.
ray.
Yeah, they have that, the LRADs, and then they have that microwave weapon now too, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the question is, so far the government has, and these have gotten way more violent in many respects than some of those other riots that 92 and stuff. But government hasn't unleashed any of that. They haven't been using lethal force. And think about that in lots of major cities. And so to me, the longer the people that are angry, and I'm not saying they shouldn't be angry and that there's not problems and they're frustrated in COVID. I recognize all that.
Mm-hmm.
But what I think ultimately, the longer you let people let's just say they're allowed to throw a tantrum every time something appears to go wrong. Okay, because at this point, we got things that are legitimately bad dudes, being stopped by police for legitimately bad crimes. And now, even though, and people are riding over that. So in my mind, we've crossed some threshold about how we deal with something in a rational way. So the thing is, the more these people are allowed to get away with it as a group, and any group would do this, right? The more they can, torching something's becoming socially protected and politically okay, which is absolutely, they're normalizing it. And that's really dangerous as a society, that you have, groups of society normalize burning down buildings, killing people, mobbing people, blocking traffic from innocent people.
I'm a very, very staunch, like, let's talk it out guy. I really do. And as like, language nerd, it's also a big part of it. Like, I love language. I love talking. I love words. I love communicating with people. And I find it very frustrating when there is, we were discussing kind of seeing multiple sides of, various issues. But yeah, I mean, I know it's like idealist bullshit, but like, I really think that, like, ideally we should talk out every problem. You know what I mean? And this is, and yeah, again, like the riots are super complicated. And I actually had an answer for you when you're saying, like, why are these less violent and why are they going on so long? Because this is something I'm thinking about too. And I have a strategic answer. I don't necessarily have like a political answer, but if the government came in, and we saw those videos of like DHS grabbing people and putting them in vans and things like that. Right. If the government came in now, like full, Duarte style, and just, full force, like military, shooting protesters that posed a threat to people, as opposed to like hitting them with, whatever they're, the bean bags and the tear gas and stuff like that. Like it would escalate to like insane levels. I mean, I think that not that they wouldn't, and not that they couldn't have an excuse to, but if the bodies were stacking up right now, like it wouldn't get better, it would get worse. Like it would be very hard for them to step in and control Portland without really getting in there, if that makes sense. And I feel like at a local level, I thought it was kind of crazy that these are going on so long too, because like I'd never seen this in the States. I'd seen this in like South America and like Mexico and stuff, where there's, day 187 of riots, or, of protests in front of the building or whatever's going on. But yeah, I'd never heard of this here. I've been to a protest that was event at a time and a place, and, all kinds of stuff like that. And my impression is basically, at a local level, like they're kind of, I mean, you saw the thing with Ted Wheeler, they had his whole apartment building staked out and the cops wouldn't touch it. They wouldn't get in there.
And that's a problem. And, this is, the fact is, I think I think you're right. I think that if they came in now, it's going to be less well received than 2.5 months ago.
But I was sort of picturing it the way you described it. I kind of pictured like as if the military came in like willing to shoot. You know what I mean?
I think, they could have shut this down I think the problem is, since they let it go for so long,
Mm-hmm.
people are getting more emboldened. They're being normalized to violence and destruction now as the response to something they perceive to be an injustice. And I'm not arguing injustices or not, and all those need to be discussed on a case-by-case basis, right? Because the world's not black and white as much as people want it to be.
As a forensic investigator, you're definitely not allowed to think the world's black and white. I didn't know that about you either. That's really cool. That's very impressive.
I'm really nerdy. We'll talk about it off the air, but yeah, it's interesting. And I say, yeah, I think that's my concern is like, so, kind of back to the startups, right? How does this impact startups? So I think since we don't even know how bad it's going to get, we don't know if this stuff's going to calm down, right? We don't know if the racial relations will improve and in what time frame. And I think the election's coming up, and I don't think anybody's going to be happy with that. So at this point, I'm expecting more normalized violence to occur then. The question is, and this is what's been interesting about Donald Trump psychologically, and is that after he got elected, right, usually the other side's a little butthurt they lost. That's kind of normal. They never got over it with Trump ever in 4 years. And to me, I think this goes back to the psychology thing too, is I think the longer if you're raging every day, and I see these people on Twitter I follow, I mean, even a lot of Silicon Valley people just rage, and Hollywood people every day for years, just raging. And to me, I think I think you can almost have like emotional damage as a society the longer you're like that. I think it changes people's personalities. And so
yeah, I have seen politics somewhat ruin people's lives before, because it turned them from and this is I've seen this both sides, honestly. People I was really close to, and it just turns someone into like a very angry person. And like, I'm not gonna argue with other people's like emotions and like their reasons for being angry, but like that's a tough way to live, man. Like it's hard to just be angry all the time.
Yeah, and I see a lot of that, and my concern about our society, right? If we can't again come back to the table and rationally discuss an issue like you were talking about, if the solution is that it's going to be violence every time and it's only going to get worse, there will be blowback and there's going to be backlash to that.
Well, should we? What about you and I moderating some right left debates, perhaps maybe getting a couple of topics and trying to actually have some kind of a rational conversation about it.
Absolutely. And I think, I think that's important. And the fact is, it comes back to how do we know our knowledge, and we could have a whole discussion on any of these issues politically, but I think the fact is we're not coming back together after the election. We didn't from the last election, and I don't think that's going to happen after this election. And so I think as society, and this gets into your startup too, right? Like, where do you pick to live? Where do you pick the headquarters for your startup? With hospital, flip. It's like, how is that going to impact? I mean, with your startup, how do you think you're going to view real estate and where you put your residence for your startup now? What are your thoughts on that with what you guys are doing?
Well, I mentioned that early. I mentioned earlier about the California wealth tax that has been being bandied about as we're launching this. So that's like, kind of on my head regarding staying in California. But I actually do have an interesting answer to that, which is that, our platform right now, our first product up is for ankle and foot exams. Like, you literally come, you do an ankle or foot exam from your phone. It's just videos, very, you're talking about like low tech versus high tech. And I actually view our platform as a very low tech digital product. There's like almost no data. One of the things is I'm a big privacy guy, because every time a hack comes out, like Canva got hacked, Reddit got hacked, like whatever it is, I swear to God, my name and password always shows up on Have I Been Pwned? And so, and I'm one of those, I feel like every time I put a phone number into, even some are legit, it's, I put my phone number into Spectrum for two-factor authentication, and 3 days later, the robocalls start, and exactly where that came from. So one of the things is that, we're, you literally just need an email to get like a physical therapist thing with us. Like, it's all like, we're not collecting data because we don't want to hold your data unnecessarily. And, I'm like, I think it's good to be private. On the where to be located thing, our physical therapists are mostly some form of freelance. Many of that, like, distributed, not in LA, in, San Bernardino County, up by Santa Barbara, like places like that. And our platform, because what we do is, if you take an exam with us, do this, ankle foot exam, if you got a sprain, and we're going to be launching more exams as we go. We're kind of doing it, following a Lumosity model, where you kind of come up with one thing at a time and kind of just release them.
Right.
Because we really want to, like, as a startup working on our first product here in this space, we want to get really, really good. It's this, like I said, it's kind of like a lo-fi product. There's no fancy technology. There's no AI yet. Although I'm really excited about the idea of doing things like skin cancer exams, or like eye exams and things like that, which could use AI in the future. But yeah, I mean, part of what I'm stoked about is that, one, our physical therapists are really good. I've kind of done a session with all of them, and the ones we have so far are trying to build an at-home, basically telehealth business. So, people who, like, one of them, their clinic got shut down, or I think it went out of business. I mean, if you think about all the dentists and all the doctor's offices that have been closed down, like, since the pandemic started, an insane amount of physical therapy businesses have closed, or, closed temporarily. So you got a lot of people trying to start freelance style. It's not exactly an Uber situation, because, like, Uber was people who weren't drivers, whereas all of a sudden you have a lot of physical therapists that are out of a job, or, some are like working at 2 or 3 places, and there's a kind of a competitor app, but actually they sort of work in sync with us a little bit, called Luna, which is to get in-home physical therapy, to do, kind of one-on-one sessions. And that's blown up since the pandemic. Man, if you invested in that, that would have been a killer investment. And it's all because, everything's closed, all the gyms are closed and everything. So, like, Luna, this competitor, you basically say, like, I'd like a physical therapist, and they come to your house, us, you take the exam at the house and it gets sent to a physical therapist. But kind of both of them, you know, one of the things I'm stoked about with, you know, Luna and especially with us is it's potentially letting people kind of like work during the pandemic. As you know too, and we're hoping that this will really sync well with our physical therapists, but like getting customers is hard. And that's essentially for the physical therapists who are working on our platform, we're just like shuffling them customers because all we're doing is the evaluations. So we get to, you know, if somebody signs up with us, every time they look at one of our evaluations, and then, you know, they have the opportunity, you know, if they want to, the patient can, you know, keep doing sessions with them, especially if they really, you know, obviously like you get a physical therapist you like, same thing with like a physical trainer or, you know, whoever, like you want to stick with them. And so in terms of, you know, kind of like locations in the pandemic, like that's probably the part I'm most stoked about, is that if, you know, pulling this off correctly would actually be providing work and like at home, or, you know, maybe like we actually, one of the things we were thinking about doing is like renting a space in LA now that real estate is just completely, commercial real estate is completely plummeted. So we're kind of like exploring deals where maybe we could build a little, you know, like a little studio kind of thing that if we get some physical, you know, they could come in and film or they could do it from home. And then for us, I mean, there's one other co-founder, you know, he's kind of like the designer hipster. He's like a DJ who's, you know, really like helps produce a lot of our visual content. And we're like best friend, you know, very close friends going back. We're in the same skateboard crew, kind of old dude skateboard crew here out here in LA. And then I'm the programmer. So we're just, you know, we're just like been building and trying to sell and things like that. But then, you know, also on the topic of like, where are we? Yeah, the whole thing's remote. And for the immediate future, like the only non-remote, I've done a lot of remote work as a programmer. So it was almost not a transition when the pandemic started. Like I almost felt bad for how little my life changed compared to some other people. But yeah, for the immediate future, like I would be 10 times more interested in getting commercial real estate to build a little studio for our PTs and a filming studio where we could do like podcasting and things like that. But like I can program at home, you know, and I think going forward, like in terms of growing out our business, you know, as we expand, if we can, you know, cut down on costs by things like real estate and having remote people work remotely, like that's awesome. And then on a programmer standpoint, you know, a lot of our stack, one, if you have a tech stack, you have to find people who program on that tech stack. And we do a lot of streaming and video. So, you know, as we grow, we'll be looking for people with some specialties. And, you know, straight up, if you can have the whole country or the whole world to look for somebody on, especially on like a tech programming side, it really makes a difference, you know, opening up your market that way. And if you're a startup where you don't necessarily have 180 grand plus an insane amount of stock to give up the way Google or Facebook does, you know, it's kind of hard to get top talent, especially in California, especially in LA, where everybody, you know, has a tendency to go to Silicon Valley if they're, because that's where a lot of the money is. If you're a programmer, move to Silicon Valley, you can make 30, 50, 70% more than you can make in LA.
Wow. Why did you guys start with the ankles?
The backing up, it actually started out as a tool for physical therapists, and, you know, for doctors and stuff. I became very interested in aggregator theory. I don't know if you read Stratechery, the Ben Thompson newsletter. Oh, it's really good. I'll forward you a couple of really good ones. He gets very deep on aggregator theory. He writes articles and articles on this. And so because it is unusual, because you know, we started out as like, okay, we want to make a tool. Like I love building streaming and video and things like that. And this was our technology was actually based off a former startup I had's tech that was, doing translation, was doing real-time translation for focus groups. That market got killed by the pandemic, and hence the, sort of exploring this space. But excuse me. Sorry, repeat the question one more time.
How did you get started, or why did you decide to go with ankle?
Oh, the ankle. The ankle was because found it to be a lot harder to be a tool that physical therapists could use, and there was already a lot of those around. When I was looking at this, like looking into aggregator theory, that companies like Google is probably the most famous aggregator in the world, but Uber, Lyft, what they do differently is Uber could very easily have taken that tool and been a tool for riders and, for like you to be a private driver and, find clients and stuff like that. But what they chose to do was own the customer relationship. And that way they were able to basically dominate the market, because rather than having like all the suppliers on their side, and then they would, make up, and this is actually very traditional medical business model for aggregators, is like insurance. You get all of the suppliers, like all of the different medical people under your umbrella, and then you kind of call the shots with the customers. This is sort of traditional business model, whereas like the new, quote unquote digital aggregator model is you control the customer relationship, and then you rely on the providers to come to you. And so looking at this model, decided like, well, how do you make a portal for people to come and get checked out? Like, what's the play there? And so I was looking at injuries, and I haven't even talked about skateboarding in terms of this, but I've mentioned a million times to you before, like essentially, like, because I know, very enmeshed in the skateboard into culture and stuff like that. Not the industry, because I don't work in skateboarding, but this was sort of our initial target market, because it just, following the crossing the chasm model of finding like a niche market that you can really get embedded in, and solve the problems for people specific, as opposed for people, a general problem, which is a lot. It tends to be for no one. You find a very specific problem. And so in the skate community, you have a big issue of people being underinsured, or a lot of times not having insurance. And what I've noticed anecdotally with a lot of my friends, a lot of people I know, is they have chronic injuries from things that they really should have gotten checked out, but never got checked out. And the two biggest ones, to be honest, are ankle and wrist. And what almost always happens is somebody gets, you sprain your ankle, at the skate park. It's bad, but you're just like, 23-year-old, maybe doesn't have insurance, definitely would struggle to pay the $160 copay to go to, a place in Santa Monica, working a couple jobs, doesn't have money for this stuff. And then they just decide to walk it off, or like, wrap it up, or get an air cast from Walgreens or something. But if it turns out that there's a microfracture in there, then that can be a permanent injury. And a lot of people get DL'd for a long time. Like, I personally know several people that essentially can't skate anymore because of wrist injury is really common. Same thing. It's like, a fracture or a really bad sprain that, essentially people take the walk it off attitude towards. And this is, this is a real bummer to me, especially when it's someone you like the idea of them having a chronic injury, like that's horrible. And especially if it's something where the reason to not get checked out is things like it's a little too expensive. You got to drive to the clinic, like LA. It sounds like a small thing, but when you got to drive an hour each way, you got to pay $15 for parking. You're injured, maybe you're taking Uber, like that sucks. And if you're on the fence about it, it's really easy to say no to it. So we figured with ours, you build something where you just take it from home, it gets forwarded to a physical therapist, and then, it takes a lot of the friction out of that experience. And then for why ankles, it was between ankles and wrists to start with. We want to have an exam that's going to be really useful, that we can like get really, really, really good. We want this to be an amazing spa-like experience that you're doing where it's pretty fun. You know, it's kind of like halfway towards doing a DUI test where you kind of walk and you stand on one foot and things like that. But
I can't
it's
pass those sober.
well, you got to try our thing, man. I'll give you a free one if you want to get checked out by a physical therapist, get you some exercises, get you some stretches.
Sure, why not? I would love to. So so are you only rolling this out in California, or is it already nationwide? How does that work?
We are trying to be very HIPAA conscious right now as HIPAA laws regarding telehealth change fairly aggressively. So we're being conscientious about doing things in state. So yeah, right now we're California focused, but that's going to be, you know, kind of rapidly changing as there's, you know, if you're in state, there's obviously that's the most over the, you know, across the board way of doing it. But then there's a lot of states that have these packs and while the pandemic goes on. So we're going to be kind of navigating these waters. But right now we're just focused on getting, basically just getting customers checked out, you know, really improving the flow with our physical therapists. They've been really helpful, and that's been a lot of fun, is kind of improving the product on their side. But, you know, we're in this launch zone, and I know that you know this well, where we've got something that we think that people seem to like, maybe a little rough around the edges, but, you know, we're polishing aggressively and trying to get really good. But right now it's about, you know, really looking for that product market fit by making something that people really like. And so, yeah, we're focused in California, but we're going to be, I mean, for any of your, especially any of your listeners who want to try this, hit us up. You can hit me up on Twitter or anything like that, and let's talk, because we're, you know, enrolling physical therapists pretty quickly. And on that side too, because it's sort of, I know the gig economy is not like very popular these days, but we essentially become an alternative revenue source for PTs. And what we've found is with the ones we're working with so far, we're like one of several revenue sources they have, you know? So it's been pretty easy, and they've been pretty stoked about it. You know, they like the idea of like working from home and stuff. So I think we're signing someone up in Seattle, and we're getting New York online really quickly.
So how does it work legally? I mean, is this like, so essentially if you have I guess if you're doing the PT is in New York and then the patient's in New York, then you'll probably be compliant. I was just
Yep.
wondering if there's much worry about crossing, you know, the borders for that. But I
Yeah,
guess,
we got to be careful about that. There's certain situations where it's legal. There's heavy implications that the enforcement's really is basically they're going to turn a blind eye to stuff, but we're trying to be really careful. And then there's, like I said, there's this like 13 state pact, which is basically a lot of like mid-country states where you can do telehealth across the, you know, from like Wyoming to, I think Utah's in it actually, or Arizona. And there's like no legal issues. And then during I keep coming to this during the pandemic, but I think we were discussing earlier, but they passed something to make basically every form of telehealth like now HIPAA compliant. And I'll have to come back and answer this question with more details, because right now we're just trying to keep it like, I mean, basically just keep it simple. But yeah, as we do this nationwide rollout, it's going to be, we're going to have to be, you know, diligent about being careful about this.
and I think that's probably prudent.
Of course.
I think we're in very dangerous times anyway right now. So, so how are you funding this? Do you got a lot of VC money, investors?
A lot of VC money. I mean, we don't have any VC money, if that counts as a lot. No, I'm just kidding. Yeah, it's all like, you know, I'm doing all the technology on my side. To be honest, at the beginning of the pandemic, I basically like marathoned a couple of freelance projects to just get a bunch of money rolling. And so it's all like literally all self-funded, you know, through my credit card. In terms of the stuff we have to do. Yeah. I just paid to get a trademark done last night. You know, $600 right there. But yeah, you know, at the moment, and I talked to you about this, like we're focused on this organic We're doing a lot of video content. We're doing a lot of, trying to do original things to kind of make our presence known and get ourselves out there. I've seen a lot of startups throw a lot of money at ad bucks, at Facebook bucks, at Instagram dollars, things like that, with uneven results. And so it could work, but that's not really, I mean, I could see just like tossing a lot of money down the furnace and being really frustrated a couple months down the line. And we're kind of fortunate to have a product where success, and more importantly, things like break even for us at this point, is like a couple of thousand customers per month. It's not, a couple million or anything like that. Like, we're a small, tight operation. We're all, like you said, we're all remote, and all the programming and all the design is done in-house. And so, for the time being, we're just kind of keeping it scrappy. The other side is, having been in a million pitch rooms and in a lot of, startup scenarios and things like that, I figured if and when it's time to do VC money or, something of that nature, one, you want to have a reason to do it. So for us, it would be, we have product market fit. We like what we're doing. Maybe we just have the ankle exam, or maybe we have 2 or 3 exams on the market. And so maybe we get VC money so that we can do, hire a sales team to open up like a bunch of different regions, or maybe we do VC money to open up in a different country, or maybe we get VC money to do, because we find out we do, to grow from, kind of scrappy level to the next level up. Like, we do need a major digital campaign. So I'm not 100% sure, and I'm not against the idea of taking stuff, but I do think it should be for a reason. And as unintuitive as it sounds, I've seen and worked at startups, not founded, but worked at startups that got way too much VC money, and it was the reason for their demise. So,
well, you're never going to hear me say no to bootstrapping. I think scrappy is a good thing. So I wish you the best success. This sounds really cool, and I do think that in the future, I think projects like yours, where people are taking the technological angle to solving healthcare related kind of issues, I think that's going to increase. And I think what you're doing is pretty cool. Thanks,
man. I really appreciate it. And, it'd be really cool. One is this kind of, it's a healthcare thing that kind of adds to the pie, because a lot of our initial, customers we're talking about, it's for things that they basically should get checked out for, but maybe aren't. And so it'll be really interesting to see. And I think that, on what you're talking about, healthcare changing, since starting this, I have talked to so many people that are involved with in-home diagnostics, in-home healthcare. Like, in 5 years, being monitored, having your doctor monitoring you while at home, and as opposed to coming into the hospital and doing an overnight, it's going to be, a reality that we couldn't even believe right now. Because I've talked to some people working on things in the space, and it's all getting, pushed really hard because of the pandemic.
I think it's going to be really interesting to watch. So,
yeah, man.
So, Jack, where can people find out more about you and your project?
Go to hospitalflip.com. And especially if you need to have ankle, foot problems, a sprain, want to get that checked out, mention this podcast, and we'll hook up a discount. But it's not very expensive though, so maybe you don't even decide you want it. And then for me, you can find me at Twitter as Jack Connor, but the K is a 5. Rob, if you post this as a with a description, maybe you can drop those things in there. But hospitalflip.com.
Jack, I'll have all that stuff up at robmcnealy.com. And folks, make sure you subscribe, mash that follow button, check out our library and our YouTube. And guys, you have a great day. Thank you for listening to the Rob McNealy program. Make sure you check us out on the web at robmcnealy.com and subscribe to our podcast at YouTube, iTunes, and on the Google Play Store.